Make sure y'all stay on point with the Puncher's Point. Welcome back to the Puncher's Point. Sadly, this is the end of the road for the Truth Era for Errol Spence Jr. because Tszyu defeats Errol Spence Jr. by unanimous decision, ending Errol Spence's fighting career, retiring him from the sport of boxing. And look, it's been a great career for Errol Spence Jr., one of the best welterweights of our generation. And on top of that, Errol Spence Jr. at one point was the best welterweight in the world. I truly believe that. Former pound for pound top 10 fighter. Errol Spence was the guy who gave us a lot of excitement in boxing. So to Errol Spence Jr., I'm just glad that he gets to retire with his head high. I'm glad that he gets to retire with his health and he gets to go and become a family man for his wife and kids. Now, on the other side of that coin, congratulations to Tszyu on defeating Errol Spence Jr. This is definitely, probably the biggest win of his career. And now Tszyu can try to chase after bigger and better things and make one more run at a world title. But obviously, we're here to talk about this fight. We're here to talk about what happened. And we are going to get to the fight breakdown. Now, if you ask me, I had this fight scored 117-111 to Tszyu. I feel like regardless of how you scored it, this was relatively a one-sided fight, and Tszyu was clearly the aggressor in this fight. He landed more crisp punches against Errol Spence Jr., and he was the aggressor in this fight as well. So I think regardless of how you look at this fight, Tszyu was the clear winner. Now, when I went back and I looked at the episode, I looked at the keys to victory that I had for Tszyu. He followed 2 out of 3 of them. The first key to victory that he followed was land the counters when he overreaches, and he did that very well, and it made it that much easier considering the fact that Errol Spence Jr. came into this fight with a leg injury. So Errol Spence Jr. didn't have the fluidity in his movement. He wasn't as slick on the defensive side as he used to be. Obviously, you take that and then you add being out of the ring for 3 years. You put those together, and obviously it's not going to be the same fighter. But he did a very good job of countering Errol Spence Jr. when he overreached, specifically with that check left hook. And he did a very good job of using that check left hook, but he also did a good job of using the straight right as a counter as well, which was one of my other keys to victory that I had for Tszyu, which was find the right moments to land that right hand. And he landed it as a whopping right hook, a straight right, a regular right hook, check right hook, whatever the case might be. That versatile right came in handy for Tszyu. The one key to victory that I wish he did a little bit more of was consistently target the body with hooks. Now, he did target the body. I feel like Errol Spence Jr. did a better job of targeting the body than Tszyu. Tszyu had his moments where he would get Errol Spence to the body. There was one moment in the later rounds where he threw a right straight to Errol Spence, and it looked like it hurt Errol Spence to his body. However, I feel like Errol Spence was a lot more active to the body than Tszyu was in this fight. And I wanted to see Tszyu establish that body work early. Now, as far as Errol Spence, when you go and you look at the keys to victory for him, the first one I had was stick the jab, and he was very active with that jab. I got to give Errol Spence some credit as far as the way he was throwing that jab. I think he did a good job of using that jab and consistently throwing it. He was trying to find the right moments to land that left hook, and there were moments where he would clip Tszyu with that left hook as well. And I feel like he had a little bit of success with that left hook, but not as much that he needed in order to win this fight. And the last key to victory, and this was the biggest reason why Errol Spence did not win this fight, push the action early and pressure him. Errol Spence Jr. did not do that. Errol Spence Jr. was constantly fighting on the back foot. And the reason why that was a problem was because you gave Tszyu all the leverage in the world to keep on coming forward. And I could see what the game plan was for Errol Spence Jr. Try to trap Tszyu, consistently move around the ring, get Tszyu to chase you, which he was doing. But at the same time, you were not the aggressor. Tszyu was. And when Tszyu would hit him with those power punches, Errol Spence Jr. started retreating. And that's been a habit of Errol Spence Jr.'s. You go and you look at the fights with Ugas. You look at the fights with Sean Porter. He has a history of getting hit with some hard punches and retreating. And obviously, when you get hit with a hard punch, your first instinct is to survive. I understand that. However, the problem with Errol Spence, usually in the prime of his career, he would come forward, he would throw his punches in bunches, and it wouldn't just be a 1-2 punch combination. However, the last few fights that Errol Spence had, the Ugas fight, the Crawford fight, in this fight, it seemed like he was doing a lot more backpedaling than normal. And so I feel like that was one of the biggest weaknesses for Errol Spence in this fight. Now, one of the punches that I think Tszyu utilized extremely well was that left hook. He used it as a nice check left hook, but specifically that right straight. And the way Tszyu was throwing that straight right, he would throw it as a counter when Errol Spence Jr. would throw that jab, or he would just throw it as an attacking punch. He would use the jab as a decoy and then basically punch right through the guard of Errol Spence Jr. One of the punches that I liked from Spence that he was landing was that left hook, but I also liked the way he was constantly throwing to the body as well. Errol Spence did some good things in this fight. The problem is he wasn't the aggressor. He was constantly throwing the jab, which is great. However, he wasn't chaining his punches together. And then the leg injury does not help either. You can't get into range against Tszyu. And both these guys had a lot of moments in the clinch, in the exchanges on the inside. And I feel like Tszyu, being the bigger fighter, was able to overpower Errol Spence Jr. And now we go to the best moments of the fight. For me, my favorite moment in the fight was round 6. Round 6, Tszyu just releasing all that pressure, just going in there and just being the aggressor against Errol Spence Jr. and seeing Errol Spence Jr. backing up and retreat. To me, that was the best moment in the fight. You could also look at round 2 where Errol Spence Jr. started to gain a little bit of heat in round 2. In my opinion, though, round 6 was the defining round of Tszyu dominating this fight. Because, yes, he was already up by a round or two. However, round 6, in the middle of that round, that's where I kind of expected Errol Spence Jr. to pick up the pace, pick up the heat. That was my prediction. I thought Errol Spence Jr. was going to start picking up the pace and he was going to get that knockout in round 8. That didn't happen. So, when you go back and you look at this fight, Tszyu establishing his dominance in round 6 with the flurry of punches that he had, to me, that was the best moment in the fight because it showed that Tszyu was going to be the aggressor. He was going to control the pace. He was going to be the guy that was going to control how this fight was going to go, and Errol Spence was going to have to react to him. There was also another moment, I believe, in the 10th or the 11th round, it was most likely the 11th, where Tszyu just lands this clean right straight and backs Errol Spence up. That was also a great moment in the fight as well. But I got to give Tszyu a lot of credit because he did a very good job of going in there and establishing his biggest strength early and just continuing to establish it through the later rounds. One of the questions that I had for Tszyu coming into this fight was, is he going to be able to go to 12 rounds? Is he going to be able to keep on picking up this pace for all 12 rounds? And he did that, and he answered that question. I got to give him a lot of respect. And so we go to what was on the line. Well, you look at the career for both these guys. Both of these guys needed this win. And it shows because of what happened after the fight was all over. I said Tszyu needed this win because he needed to take one step closer at becoming a world champion one more time in his career. Errol Spence Jr. needed this win because the last time we saw him was 3 years ago when he lost to Crawford. And so we had all these questions of what was he going to look like. And if he didn't win this fight, most likely it was going to be the end for Errol Spence Jr. And as we know it, after the fight, he calls it quits and he retires from the sport of boxing. So we know how impactful it is to their individual careers. However, what was on the line as far as both these guys? There was no title on the line, and it just seemed like a fight that both of these guys needed in order to propel them to the next level, in order to get them towards the next hump. Both of these guys are in survival mode in their career. Tszyu now, especially, is in that mode in his career. I mean, you already lost to Sebastian Fundora twice. You had a brutal loss to Bakar Murtazaliyev. And now you finally beat a legend like Errol Spence Jr., who's going to be a future Hall of Famer when it's all said and done. Obviously, that's a whole debate for a different time, but I truly believe that Errol Spence Jr. is going to be a future Hall of Famer. However, with Tszyu, now you have a chance to make your name in this 154-pound division. He talked about going up to 160 and challenging Erslandy Lara. You know, you obviously got Janabek, and I'm not sure if Janabek is still the champion. Somebody Definitely comment down below if that's true. I know Janabek tested positive for PEDs, so I don't know what the result of that was. However, he could make a run and become a multiple division champion at 160 pounds. That could be a possibility for Tim Tszyu. He could also try to make a run and reclaim a belt at 154 pounds too. There's some fights there for Tim Tszyu. However, Tim Tszyu's got one more chance to capture a world title. And to me, it almost looks like the way Kambosos' career went. Kambosos got that win against Maxie Hughes, and then after that win, it seemed like Kambosos was back into the title picture. He had a shot at the IBF championship against Lomachenko, and Lomachenko ended up stopping him in the later rounds. However, then you go and you fast forward and you look at the fight against Richardson Hitchens, and you see what happens there, and then that's when you start seeing Kambosos plateau. This looks pretty similar with Tim Tszyu. You just had brutal losses to Fundora and Bakr Murtazaliev. Now you finally have a chance to recapture gold again. Are you going to be able to do it? And that's a question for another time. So as far as what was on the line for both of these fighters, Errol Spence needed this win to get back into boxing and to get himself back to being a champion. Tim Tszyu needed this win for his legacy, but not only that, to also make one more run at becoming a world champion again. And now the last question, how does this impact the sport of boxing? Well, Tim Tszyu finally won. So now you got to think about the possibilities that there are. He could stay in the 154-pound division and fight somebody like Joran Butsanis or Virgil Ortiz. Now with all the major boxing promotions, besides Zuffa, y'all know how most boxing fans feel about that. Besides Zuffa, all of the major boxing promotions are now under the DAZN banner. So that's a very big positive for the sport of boxing as well. So he could make that fight with Virgil Ortiz, or he could make that fight with Joran Butsanis. There's fights there to be made. Maybe Sebastian Fundora a third time, but we all know what most likely the outcome is going to be of that one. He could go up to 160 and challenge somebody like Lara, and I think he's got a good chance against Lara. He can go and challenge somebody like Janabek. I don't like his chances against Janabek, to be honest with you. So there's potential. There's potential matchups for Tim Tszyu, but the question for Tim Tszyu is this. Is beating an Errol Spence, who has been away from the ring for 3 years with a hurt leg, enough to get you back into a title picture? Is it enough? Are we going off of the name alone, which is Errol Spence Jr., one of the best welterweights of our generation? Or do we have to look at the real picture involved in this, which is Errol Spence not being in the ring for 3 years, having a hurt leg, ring rust, new trainer that he's never worked with before, that he's never had a fight with? Are we looking at those things, and are we banking that Tim Tszyu is going to get a title shot off of this? Is that enough? And to me, I say no. I think Tim Tszyu needs to have a fight against a real contender, against a guy who can actually make a run in one of these divisions to see where Tim Tszyu is in his career. To me, that's what I think needs to happen. So as far as the impact in the sport, it's still undetermined what this is going to do for Tim Tszyu, and it's still undetermined how this is going to affect the division, the 154-pound division and the 160-pound division. Again, only time will tell. And so we go to the overall fight grade now. I had this fight grade rated a 7 out of 10. I gave the strategy and the excitement a 7 out of 10. Again, as far as strategy, I think both guys did some things well, but I also think both of these guys didn't really establish what they could actually do in these fights. I think both these guys kind of need to improve on some things. Obviously, Errol Spence being retired for now, that's one side. But the other side is Tim Tszyu still trying to make a run. And I think that he's definitely going to need to make some improvements before getting to this next fight. As far as the stakes, I give it a 7.5. Again, both these guys had major implications in their career. However, there was no title on the line. But the reason why I gave the stakes a 7.5 is because for both of these guys, it was sink or swim. You were either going to win this match or you were going to lose. And if you lost, it was not going to be great for your career. If the roles were reversed, if Errol Spence won this fight and Tim Tszyu lost this fight, I don't think Tim Tszyu comes back for another fight. I truly think that Tim Tszyu would probably have retired in that ring as well, or we wouldn't see him for a very long time. And then last but not least, the impact, I gave it a 6 because it's still undetermined, but at the same time, like I said before, I don't think beating an Errol Spence who hasn't been in the ring for 3 years with a hurt leg, a new trainer, and all this ring rust, especially him admitting that he just went with the flow and he just winged it throughout his entire career. I don't think that's enough to get Tim Tszyu back into a title picture. And the last question would be for this entire episode is, what is next for Tim Tszyu? Well, we already explained what the potential possibilities are for Tim Tszyu throughout his career. And I go and I look at it, and I want to see Tim Tszyu fight somebody that's going to actually test his limits, that's going to actually answer the question of, is he ready for a fight? Is he ready to take the next step? And again, he can go into the 160-pound division. He can go into the 154-pound division. I think he's very adamant about going to the 160-pound division. Maybe you go and you fight Erzlandi Lara. I do think that's a good fight. I would like to see that happen. I want to see Tim Tszyu take that Danny Garcia role, take that Sean Porter role of being the gatekeeper of the division. I want to see if Tim Tszyu really has that in him, which means I want to see him fight guys like Amari Jones, Shane Mosley Jr. I want to see him fight guys like Aaron McKenna. These types of guys, these young guys who are making this climb in the 160-pound division, I want to see him fight one of those guys next in order to prove to me that he's capable of getting a title shot against somebody like Erzlandi Lara or Janabek or Carlos Adames. I want to see if he's got it in him. As a matter of fact, I got one more name for you. Jesus Ramos versus Tim Tszyu. In my opinion, that right there is the fight to make at 160 pounds. I think that's a perfect fight because Jesus Ramos is a problem for anybody in that 160-pound division. That's a guy still chasing a world title and is an interim champion at that. And at the same time, this is a guy that's going to go in there and is going to really test Tim Tszyu to see what he is made of. Congratulations, you beat Errol Spence Jr. Before him, you beat a bunch of guys we never heard of. And this is no knock on Tim Tszyu. I already can see people in the comments saying, how dare you trash Tim Tszyu? You've never been in the ring. I'm not trashing Tim Tszyu. I'm being as realistic as I can possibly be. I have nothing against Tim Tszyu. I think Tim Tszyu is a great fighter. I'm a fan of the way he fights. However, I still got questions after the two brutal losses to Fundora and the big brutal loss against Bakar Murtazaliyev. So I think if you're going to go up to 160 pounds, test your skills. Test where you are with somebody like Jesus Ramos and then try to challenge for that WBC championship against Carlos Adames. Or you can fight Erzlandi Lara. You can fight Yonel Hernandez. Again, Amari Jones, Shane Mosley Jr. There's some names that you could fight in this 160-pound division. But I think him versus Jesus Ramos makes the most sense because Jesus Ramos is a very, very tough and difficult fight for anybody in this 160-pound division. He's an interim champion, so if you beat him, you automatically get a bid into the WBC belt. And at the same time, this really proves where Tim Tszyu is in his career. So that would be the fight I would like to see next. If he goes at 154, I would love to see him fight somebody like Israel Madrimov. I would love to see him fight somebody like Josh Kelly, who beat Bakar Murtazaliyev. Let's see where he's at there. But for me, I think Israel Madrimov would be a good stylistic matchup to see where Tim Tszyu is. I think Israel Madrimov and Jesus Ramos, to me, those two guys should be the next opponent for Tim Tszyu. And again, put him as a co-main event on the next PBC card. I think that's a great idea. But like I always say, time is going to tell. Again, shout out to Tim Tszyu on winning a unanimous decision victory against Errol Spence Jr. As far as Errol Spence Jr., look, it's been a great career. He left us boxing fans with a lot of great memories again, and his resume is stacked. Kell Brook, Danny Garcia, Mikey Garcia, Sean Porter, Terrence Crawford. He has a stacked resume. He's fought some of the best fighters in his generation. He's beaten most of them. And unfortunately, this is where the road ends for Errol Spence Jr. But again, he gets to retire with his health. He gets to go back to his family. He made a lot of money throughout his career. So overall, he's done it all in this career. He's been a world champion. He's made a boatload of money. He's sold out stadiums. Errol Spence Jr. is forever going to be a legend in boxing. He is going to be a future Battle Hall of Famer. So congratulations on Errol Spence Jr. on an incredible boxing career. And with that being said, it's time for us to wrap up. Make sure y'all continue to tune into the Puncher's Point on the YouTube, the podcast platforms, and even the social medias. and get the word around that the Puncher's Point is the future of boxing. Tell everybody that you know. What do you have to scream it in the streets? What do you have to tell it on social media? What do you have to call people and let them know? The Puncher's Point is the future, and we are here to stay. And last but not least, make sure y'all stay on point with the Puncher's Point.